This isn't just another off-season rumor, and it's definitely not just about hiring a head coach. What's quietly forming behind the scenes feels more like a power grab that could redraw the lines of control inside an NFL franchise. At the center of it all is Jim Harbaugh, a coach who isn't asking for permission, compromise, or patience. He's demanding authority, full authority. And if the Cleveland Browns say yes, they're not just changing coaches, they're gambling their entire organizational identity on one man's vision. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. This move isn't being driven by desperation alone, it's being accelerated by timing. The league feels it, front offices feel it, and one young quarterback, whether he likes it or not, is becoming the pressure point that could make this all snap into place. Shedeur Sanders isn't being talked about like a project or a development piece anymore. He's being positioned as leverage, as justification, as the reason a franchise might be willing to tear down its own structure just to start over clean. The Browns have lived in chaos for so long that chaos almost feels normal. Rotating quarterbacks, shifting philosophies, constant resets with no real direction. But this moment feels different because it isn't reactive, it's deliberate. Harbaugh isn't floating his name quietly or waiting for the right opening. He's drawing a line and daring someone to cross it. Give me control or don't call me at all. In Cleveland, of all teams, might be the one unstable enough or bold enough to listen. That's what makes this situation so volatile. If the Browns commit, they're not just betting on wins and losses, they're betting that one quarterback can carry not only an offense, but the emotional weight of a franchise overhaul. They're betting that one coach can outperform an entire committee, and they're betting that clarity, even if it's brutal, is better than another decade of half measures and quiet failure. Because once this door opens, there's no walking it back, and what happens next won't just affect Cleveland, it could challenge how power works across the entire league. The moment Jim Harbaugh made his expectations public, the tone across the league shifted. This wasn't a coach floating interest or feeling out options. This was a declaration. Full control over roster decisions, authority over staffing, direct influence on personnel, and a salary that sits in quarterback territory, not coaching pay. That combination hit the NFL like a pressure wave because it challenged one of the league's most protected ideas, that no single coach should ever hold that much power. For decades, the NFL has operated on a carefully enforced balance. Owners fund the vision, general managers build the roster, and coaches execute what they're handed. That separation is intentional. It creates buffers. If things fall apart, blame gets spread out and stability is preserved. Harbaugh's demands tear straight through that safety net. He isn't interested in managing someone else's plan or being the final piece of a puzzle he didn't design. He wants to be the architect, the builder, and the one held responsible when it all collapses or succeeds. That level of ownership is almost unheard of in the modern league. What rattled executives wasn't just the control, it was the confidence behind it. Harbaugh didn't soften the message with diplomacy. No, we'll see. No, open to collaboration. His stance was simple and rigid. Authority is non-negotiable. Accountability only works if power is centralized. And that logic, uncomfortable as it is, forced front offices to confront an ugly truth. When decisions are made by committee, responsibility gets blurred. When things fail, everyone survives. Harbaugh is offering the opposite: one voice, one vision, one target if it goes wrong. The money amplified the shock. A $20 million ask isn't about lifestyle or ego, it's insulation. That price makes a coach harder to fire, harder to undermine, and nearly impossible to ignore. It buys time, it buys patience, and most importantly, it buys freedom from short-term panic. In a league obsessed with instant results, that kind of runway feels dangerous. For ownership groups used to having the final word, it's even more unsettling. Writing that check doesn't just secure a coach, it hands over leverage. What truly shook the league, though, was how many teams didn't immediately dismiss it. Whispers spread fast, phones rang. Front offices quietly asked themselves whether the old structure was actually protecting them or just trapping them in endless mediocrity. Harbaugh's posture exposed a crack in the system, and cracks invite pressure. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one coach negotiating hard. It was about whether the league's power hierarchy still makes sense in a world where results matter more than tradition. That's why this moment matters. If a franchise proves willing to meet Harbaugh's terms, it won't be viewed as reckless, it'll be seen as experimental. And experiments, especially successful ones, have a way of rewriting rules. But before anyone talks about wins or losses, there's a more immediate question hanging in the air. Who is desperate enough or brave enough to be first? For most franchises, Jim Harbaugh's demands would be a non-starter. Too much power, too much risk, too much disruption to an already established hierarchy. But the Cleveland Browns aren't most franchises, and that's exactly why this conversation is happening at all. Cleveland isn't weighing comfort against chaos. They're choosing between chaos they know and chaos they might finally control. This is a team that has tried every version of the smart rebuild: analytical front offices, collaborative leadership, careful roster construction, short-term patches at quarterback. Each attempt promised stability, and each one collapsed under its own contradictions. Coaches were hired to fix quarterbacks who didn't fit their systems. Quarterbacks were drafted for schemes that disappeared 2 years later. General managers preached patience while the ground shifted beneath them. Nothing ever stuck long enough to grow roots. From Cleveland's perspective, incremental change has been the real failure. Tweaks around the edges, adjustments that looked responsible on paper but led to the same result: another reset, another apology to fans, another explanation about process. That's why Harbaugh's offer doesn't feel reckless inside that building. It feels decisive. For the first time in years, someone isn't asking the Browns to trust the process. He's asking them to choose a direction and stop hedging. There's also a quiet acknowledgement happening behind closed doors. Balance hasn't protected Cleveland, it's diluted accountability. When power is shared, blame is shared too, and that's allowed dysfunction to survive far longer than it should have. Harbaugh's model removes that escape hatch. If he succeeds, he owns the credit. If it fails, there's nowhere to hide. For a franchise tired of pretending small improvements equal progress, that kind of clarity is strangely attractive. Cleveland's interest is also being shaped by timing. This isn't a roster stripped down to nothing. It's not a franchise at rock bottom. It's a team hovering in that dangerous middle ground where expectations exist but direction doesn't. Ownership knows another safe hire won't change that. Another collaborative approach just resets the clock without altering the outcome. Harbaugh represents a clean break, not just from past personnel, but from past thinking. And then there's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. Cleveland has nothing left to protect. Their structure hasn't earned loyalty. Their hierarchy hasn't delivered consistency. Saying yes to Harbaugh would be a gamble, but saying no means doubling down on a system that's already
failed them repeatedly. When viewed through that lens, entertaining this idea isn't desperation, it's realism. That's why the Browns are listening instead of laughing. They're not being sold on promises of culture or vibes or long-term alignment. They're being offered a hard reset with clear authorship, one vision, one voice, one person to believe in or move on from. And just as this idea starts to feel logical instead of terrifying, another piece slides into place: a quarterback whose presence makes this entire gamble feel possible. What makes this entire situation click isn't just philosophy or power, it's fit. And when Jim Harbaugh looks at Shedeur Sanders, he isn't seeing a finished product or a headline machine. He's seeing something far more valuable to a coach obsessed with control and development. He's seeing someone moldable, someone talented enough to build around, but not so defined that they come with unbreakable habits or ego-driven expectations. Harbaugh has never chased flash for the sake of attention. His blueprint doesn't revolve around viral throws or inflated stat lines.
It revolves around discipline, responsibility, and a quarterback who can handle being the extension of the coach on the field. Sanders fits that profile in a way that isn't immediately obvious if you're only watching highlight reels. His game isn't about chaos or freelancing. It's about timing, composure, and staying within structure even when the moment gets loud. What separates Sanders in Harbaugh's eyes is how he processes pressure. Not just defensive pressure, but situational pressure. Third down decisions, late game pacing, post-game accountability. Sanders doesn't frame setbacks as excuses or deflections, he absorbs them. He speaks like someone who already understands the weight of being the guy, even before the league fully hands him that title. That mental posture matters more to Harbaugh than arm talent alone ever could. There's also something crucial about where Sanders is in his career right now. He isn't locked into a single offensive identity. He hasn't been overcoached into rigidity or broken by constant system changes. He's early enough that his habits are still forming, but experienced enough to recognize the stakes. That middle ground is rare, and it's exactly where Harbaugh thrives. Give him a quarterback who is open to instruction, resistant to panic, and capable of growth, and he's willing to invest everything else around that player. Sanders' public demeanor only strengthens the alignment. His interviews are measured, not rehearsed, direct but not defensive. There's no bravado masking uncertainty, no performative confidence designed for cameras. That tone signals coachability. It tells Harbaugh that this is someone who can be corrected without fracturing, challenged without shutting down, and trusted to represent the team without becoming a distraction. In Harbaugh's system, the quarterback isn't just running plays, he's carrying the philosophy. Every mistake is visible. Every success amplifies the system itself. That requires a level of emotional control that most young quarterbacks struggle to maintain. Sanders has shown flashes of that control already, and that's why his name keeps surfacing in this conversation. He's not the loudest option, he's not the most hyped, but he might be the cleanest slate. And that's what makes him dangerous in the best way. Because when a coach demands absolute authority, the last thing he wants is a quarterback pulling in a different direction. Sanders isn't pushing against structure, he's leaning into it. And that alignment, subtle as it looks right now, is what allows the bigger gamble to even make sense.
What's happening around Shedeur Sanders right now goes far beyond throws, reads, or wins and losses. There's a quieter evaluation unfolding, one most fans don't notice, but coaches never stop watching. It's the pressure test. Not the kind that shows up on a stat sheet, but the kind that decides whether a quarterback survives when the spotlight turns unforgiving. And the moment Jim Harbaugh entered the conversation, that test intensified overnight. Every rep Sanders takes is now carrying added weight, not because he's expected to be perfect, but because he's being measured for durability. How does he respond after a rough series? How does he speak after a loss? Does the tone change? Does frustration leak out? Or does he stay centered and accountable? For Harbaugh, these aren't soft traits, they're prerequisites. A quarterback who can't withstand scrutiny will fracture under a system where excuses don't exist and responsibility is non-negotiable. The media side of this matters more than people admit. In Cleveland, quarterbacks don't just play football, they manage noise. Every mistake becomes a talking point. Every hesitation gets magnified. Sanders has already stepped into that environment, and what stands out isn't confidence, it's control. He doesn't dodge questions, he doesn't inflate his role, he doesn't shift blame. That neutrality under pressure signals emotional discipline, and that's the kind of discipline Harbaugh builds his entire structure around. There's also an expectation of growth baked into this evaluation. Harbaugh's system isn't plug and play, it demands evolution. A quarterback has to absorb criticism, apply it quickly, and show measurable adjustment week to week. Sanders is being watched for that exact curve, not just what he does wrong, but how fast he corrects it. The league is full of talented quarterbacks who resist coaching the moment they taste success. Harbaugh knows that pattern too well. He's looking for the opposite.
What makes this pressure test uncomfortable is that Sanders didn't ask for it. He didn't declare himself the face of a rebuild. He didn't tie his name to a power struggle. But circumstance doesn't care about intention. By simply fitting what Harbaugh wants, Sanders has become part of a much bigger equation, one where his composure is being used as evidence that a radical structure could work. And that's where things get heavy. If Harbaugh arrives, there are no buffers. Quarterback and coach become a single unit in the public eye. Success belongs to both. Failure belongs to both. There's no coordinator to shield blame and no front office philosophy to lean on. Sanders would be performing inside a system that demands presence, accountability, and resilience every single week. So when Sanders steps in front of a microphone and speaks plainly about missed reads or execution errors, that's not just good media training, it's proof of survival instinct. It shows he understands that leadership in this environment isn't volume or charisma, it's steadiness. And for a coach who believes pressure reveals truth, that steadiness might be the most important signal of all. As this vision starts to feel more real, another storyline tightens behind the scenes, and it's the one Cleveland can't avoid. It isn't just about bringing in Jim Harbaugh, it's about what happens to the power structure that already exists the moment he walks through the door. Because if Harbaugh gets what he's asking for, there's one position that immediately becomes unstable, and that's held by Andrew Berry. Berry has spent years building Cleveland around a very different philosophy: analytical models, controlled risk, collaborative decision-making, clear chains of approval. It's a system designed to
Remove emotion and reduce volatility. On paper, it makes sense, but Harbaugh doesn't operate on paper. He operates on instinct, timing, and conviction. And those two approaches don't just disagree, they compete. You can't have full autonomy under one while preserving full authority under the other. What makes this a genuine power struggle is that neither role is designed to be secondary. A general manager with final say over the roster can't coexist with a head coach demanding control over personnel. Eventually, every big decision forces a showdown. Who picks the quarterback? Who decides when to move on from a veteran? Who reshapes the staff? Those aren't abstract debates, they're weekly realities. And in Cleveland, they've already seen how damaging blurred authority can be. Berry's silence throughout this process has been louder than any statement. No leaks, no public reassurance, no positioning. That kind of quiet usually signals one of two things: confidence or calculation. Either way, it underscores how serious the situation has become. If Harbaugh arrives, Berry's role doesn't just change around the edges, it fundamentally shrinks. And that's not an adjustment every front office leader is willing to make quietly. From ownership's perspective, this is where the risk sharpens. Choosing Harbaugh doesn't just mean backing a coach, it means choosing one leadership style over another and accepting the fallout. There's no hybrid model that works here. Shared power slows decisions. Slowed decisions erode Harbaugh's entire premise. One vision has to dominate, and that inevitably leaves someone diminished or gone. Cleveland's history only adds tension to this moment. The franchise has lived through years of internal friction disguised as collaboration. Coaches blamed rosters, front offices blamed development. Accountability floated instead of landing. Harbaugh's arrival would end that overnight, but it would do so by force. Clear hierarchy, clear authority, clear consequences. This is why the situation feels so unstable, because the real drama isn't happening on the field or in press conferences. It's happening in closed rooms, where leverage is being weighed and futures are being quietly negotiated. Someone will lose influence, someone will gain it, and once that shift happens, there's no resetting the balance. Cleveland won't just look different, it will operate differently. If this works, it won't just be remembered as a bold hire by the Cleveland Browns, it would be seen as a stress test on the entire NFL power structure, because what Jim Harbaugh is proposing isn't a tweak or an evolution, it's a challenge, a direct question aimed at a league that's grown comfortable with layers, committees, and shared responsibility. What if the system itself is slowing winning down? For years, the NFL has treated centralized authority as something dangerous, too much ego, too much risk, too many ways for it to go wrong. But the flip side of that caution has been paralysis. Decisions filtered through too many voices, coaches tasked with executing plans they didn't design, quarterbacks asked to adapt to philosophies that change every few seasons. If a fully empowered coach builds a winner, it forces the league to confront whether balance has become a crutch instead of a strength. That's why other owners are watching this so closely, not publicly, but carefully. If Cleveland hands Harbaugh the reins and the team stabilizes, even without immediate dominance, it sets a precedent.
It says authority plus accountability might outperform collaboration plus protection. It says giving one leader full responsibility doesn't guarantee failure. It might actually accelerate clarity. The implications ripple quickly. Other elite coaches begin asking harder questions. Why am I disposable after 2 seasons if I don't control personnel? Why am I blamed for development when I didn't choose the pieces? Front offices feel pressure to justify why coaches answer for outcomes they don't fully shape. Suddenly, leverage shifts. Not overnight, but enough to make ownership uncomfortable. There's also a quarterback angle the league can't ignore. Harbaugh's model is quarterback-centric in the purest sense. Develop one voice, build the system around him, protect the structure long enough for growth to occur. If that approach works, it challenges the churn most franchises accept as normal. The cycle of draft, discard, repeat starts to look less like necessity and more like impatience. What scares the league isn't dominance, it's replication. Once a model proves effective, especially in a place as historically unstable as Cleveland, it becomes harder to dismiss. Owners don't want revolutions, but they respond to results, and nothing motivates change faster than seeing someone else win doing the opposite of what you believed was safe. That's the real threat here. Not that Harbaugh takes control, but that he proves control works. Because if one franchise escapes dysfunction by choosing clarity over comfort, the league has to ask itself how many others have been losing simply because no one was truly in charge. If this collapses, it won't be brushed off as just another bad hire. Failure under this model would land heavier, linger longer, and cut deeper than any rebuild the Cleveland Browns have lived through before. Because if Jim Harbaugh is given full authority, there are no built-in excuses left to deploy. No committees to blame, no philosophical misalignment to hide behind. One vision would own the wreckage completely. That's what makes the risks so sharp. When power is centralized, accountability is unforgiving. If the roster falters, it's not a scouting failure or an analytical miss. If the quarterback stalls, it's not a system mismatch. If the culture fractures, there's no buffer between leadership and outcome. Everything points back to the same source, and in Cleveland's case, that would mean confronting the possibility that even total control couldn't fix what decades of incremental change couldn't either. The damage wouldn't be limited to the coaching staff. A failure here would echo through the front office and ownership in ways previous collapses never did. It would signal that the problem isn't structure, patience, or philosophy. It's something more foundational. That realization is uncomfortable for a league that believes any franchise can be repaired with the right alignment. Proving that belief wrong forces harder questions, ones no one likes answering. There's also the quarterback cost. Shedeur Sanders wouldn't just be a young player in a system that didn't work. He would become tethered to the downfall of an entire regime before fully establishing himself. Fair or not, narratives don't wait. If this experiment fails, Sanders wouldn't simply reset with the next staff. He'd be evaluated through the lens of whether he could carry the weight of a radical rebuild. That's an unfair burden, but one the league is quick to assign. For Cleveland, the aftermath would be brutal. Another reset wouldn't feel like misfortune, it would feel like confirmation. Confirmation that bold choices don't matter, that clarity doesn't guarantee competence, that even tearing everything down to the studs leaves the same cracks in the foundation. And that kind of failure doesn't inspire patience, it breeds cynicism. That's why this moment is so defining. The Browns aren't just deciding whether to try something new, they're deciding whether they can survive the consequences if that something new doesn't work. Because once you go all in on one vision, There's no pretending the next rebuild is different. The stakes become existential, not competitive, and that's a risk most franchises spend their entire existence avoiding. When you strip away the rumors, the negotiations, and the speculation, this comes down to one uncomfortable choice: not whether Jim Harbaugh is the right coach or whether Shedeur Sanders can develop into a long-term answer. The real question is whether the Cleveland Browns are finally ready to choose clarity over comfort. For years, Cleveland has lived in the space between bold and safe, not rebuilding fully, not committing fully. Just enough change to reset hope, but never enough direction to sustain it. Harbaugh isn't offering a compromise, he's offering authorship. One vision, one voice, one chain of command. That kind of structure terrifies organizations that like options, but it also eliminates the confusion that's haunted Cleveland for decades. What makes this moment different is the alignment, a coach demanding total authority, a quarterback built for pressure, not headlines, a franchise that's run out of patience with half measures. If this move happens, no one will wonder who's responsible for the outcome. Success and failure will have clear names attached. And in a league that thrives on shared blame, that kind of transparency is radical. So this isn't just about winning games next season. It's about deciding what kind of franchise Cleveland wants to be, one that protects itself with structure and safety nets, or one that takes a single defined swing and lives with the result. Because doing nothing is still a choice, and it's one the Browns know all too well. That's the question hanging over this entire situation. Not can this work, but are they brave enough to find out?